And we're live. Hello and welcome to A Mighty Blaze. My name is Kimberly Hensle, Lowrance, and I'm your host today for a very special presentation on parenting and creativity. For those of you tuning in for our regularly scheduled program, which is Authors of Bookstores, we are not broadcasting today, but we will be back next Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and we hope that you will come back and join us then. Today, we are having a conversation about the issues facing writers, really all creative types, who are looking to juggle a life of art and a family life. We'll discuss the challenges of achieving these goals, strategies for making it work, and so much more. We are very glad that you are here. We're very glad that our panelists are here. So let's get started. First, this is already
Hi, Amy John.
We're happy you're here too. And you're right, we are lucky to have so many brilliant writers. So first, a little of an explanation about A Mighty Blaze. We are a social media community helping writers and readers connect online in the age of COVID and beyond. We help literary endeavors pivot to the digital age. We have online shows, we've put literary festivals online as well, and we've been in operation since March 2020. And through our efforts, we shine a light on storytelling and creativity, essential parts of our culture and our collective human experience. If you're watching live with us on Facebook and YouTube, you can, like Amy Jo, post a question below the broadcast or a comment, and we will get to as many as we can later on. Now, let me introduce our panel. Okay, first of all, we welcome Kate Hope Day, who comes back to A Mighty Blaze for the second time. We're very happy to have you again with us, Kate. Kate is the author of If Then and In the Quick. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Pittsburgh before she became a published novel. There's In the Quick. It's a great book. Please go read it right away. So before she was a published novelist, Kate was an associate producer at HBO. She comes to us today from Oregon, where she lives with her husband and 2 children. Julia Fine is also with us today. Julia is the author of The Upstairs House and What Should Be Wild. And she's going to show us her book, The Upstairs House. But What Should Be Wild, your first book, was shortlisted for the Bram Stoker Superior First Novel Award and the Chicago Review of Books Award. Julia teaches writing in the Chicago area, where she lives with her husband and children. Okay, and now we go to Texas, where Katie Gutierrez joins us. Katie has an MFA from Texas State University, and her writing has appeared in Harper's Bazaar, The Washington Post, Long Reads, Texas Monthly, and many more places. Her debut novel, More Than You'll Ever Know, will be published in 2022. So we have to wait. But keep an eye on her website, and we'll post Katie's website below so you can pre-order her book. Katie lives in San Antonio, Texas with her family, and when she's not writing, she can usually be found trying to get her kids to nap. I think we've all been there. Okay, and finally, I'm very pleased to welcome Melissa Rivero. Melissa is the author of The Affairs of the FALCÓNS, which won the 2019 New American Voices Award and the 2020 International Latino Book Award. The book was also longlisted for the PEN/Hemingway Debut Novel Prize, the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, and the Aspen Words Literary Prize. Born in Lima, Peru, and raised in Brooklyn, Melissa is a graduate of NYU and the Brooklyn Law School, and she lives in Brooklyn with her family. Welcome, all of you. This is
Thank
wonderful
you.
So many wonderful writers, so many fabulous books to read. We are so lucky. Okay, so let's get started. For those of you in the audience, we're going to have a conversation. We have some questions prepared, but we want to have a lot of back and forth, and we encourage your questions as well. Please post them below, again, as we mentioned. Okay, so hello, Alex. Okay, so to kick us off, there was a tweet that went around on Twitter last year by a woman named Jennifer Lynn Barnes, who was also an author, a YA author, and she was talking about a Q&A that she was at with Nora Roberts, who's the romance novelist. Mm-hmm. And someone in the audience asked her, how do you balance writing and kids? And she said that the key was to the key to juggling, she didn't say you could balance. She clearly said juggle. Because we all know balance is impossible. But she said the key to juggling is to know that some of the balls you have in the air are made of plastic and some are made of glass. And if you drop a plastic ball, it bounces, so there's no harm done. But if you drop a glass ball, it'll shatter. So you have to know which one is glass and which one is plastic. And it makes me think so much about the metaphor. It's a metaphor for like so many things in life, but especially for this challenge of writing, being creative, raising good humans, right? Good humans. And so it makes me think, and I don't know who wants to jump in first, but how do you know which ball you prioritize when? Which ball is the child or the children, the family? Which ball is the writing? Which ball you have to keep in the air that moment? Which can rest? Anybody? You're like, oh.
I mean, go for it, Melissa.
For me, it's always the writing, which is probably not like not a thing that probably people would have expected. But like for me, like a happy mom, like I'm happy if I write. When I don't write, I feel like I can't necessarily put the best of me into the other aspects of my life. So, which is why I try to make writing the first thing that I do in the mornings, because then it's accomplished, even if it's just 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And then I can go about, with the kids, with my day job, and everything else. But for me, it's always prioritizing the writing, because it's what makes me happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. There have been times recently. I have a baby who's almost 9 months. He'll be 9 months old this week, and a toddler who's 3. And the last 9 months of having a baby and a toddler during the pandemic, everybody can relate, have been really challenging, especially because the baby still doesn't sleep through the night. So it's been tough to do all of that with the lack of sleep on top of things. And I used to think, using that analogy, that I had to keep all of those balls in the air every day in a similar way, or else I would feel out of sorts and just kind of bad. And I think lately I've been taking like a longer view to it, in terms of if I can keep the glass balls in the air over the course of a week, right? And maybe only drop the plastic balls a couple of times, maybe even drop one glass ball, but it's all over the course of a longer period of time versus the pressure to do everything every day, which for me is impossible. That eases the pressure a little bit. And it gives me a sense of not having failed at the end of the day if I don't get to write that day, or if I don't enjoy my children that day, or if I don't exercise or spend time with my husband, or those are the glass balls to me, kind of those 4 things. And in a great day, I would be able to do them all, but that doesn't normally happen. So if I get a week where, they're up in the air more so than they're not, I can feel okay about things. But I do like that analogy.
Yeah, I think the long view is so important. And I also have a toddler and a baby. I'm just like a few months ahead of Katie. I think both of my children are just like slightly older. My daughter is almost 11 months old. And I think with both of my kids, my son is now 4, the first like 9 months of their lives, I really didn't write. When my son was born, I had sold my first book and it was going to come out, and I had like the ends of my sort of edits for that book. So I had to do that. That was sort of contracted work that I had to do. But other than that, I didn't really write. I got really down on myself about the fact that I wasn't writing. It was really difficult. I felt like I wasn't, juggling things appropriately. But then with my daughter, part of it was COVID, and part of it I think was recognizing too, like when you have a small baby, it's okay if, you're not working on a project in the same way, or it's okay. It's not like you're not saying goodbye to it forever. It's just sort of like a season of your life in which maybe the priority has to shift. And now, she's 11 months old and I'm writing every day and working on a new project, and it sort of feels like, okay, I'm back to it. But I think giving myself, like being kinder to myself about the fact that I wasn't working on it, not thinking like I'm throwing my career away, I've thrown my feminism, like who knows, but just like the fact that, it's okay if one of those balls is not only glass, but like so massive that, you know, you're not sleeping and you're not writing and you're not doing these things. Like there are times where that's going to happen. And in a way, if you can look at it as something that sort of like is going to, like, you can like stockpile your creativity almost for like when you do have the opportunity, I think that's been really helpful to me in terms of balancing and trying not to sort of be too hard on myself.
Kate?
Yeah, I'm going to echo what many of you have said. I think I'm past the baby stage, which is its own set of challenges, and but I think Melissa and I are in a similar situation where we were having to navigate remote school and just constantly changing schedules. And I went from having written my second novel while my kids were at school with almost, I would call it now, like an obscene amount of time. And I did write a book when in little moments of time, my first book. So I had already experienced that. So it felt so amazing to be able to just spend the entire day writing. And then that all just got taken away like all at once. And I spent several months just being angry that I had to, like Melissa was saying, I'm not a great mom when I haven't had any time to write or even just think about the thing that I'm working on. And I had just started a new novel in February of 2020. And I had a lot of like energy, and I had this plan to come up with 50,000 words, like really fast. And I had started that, and I had like a lot of momentum, and I have had over the course of the last year and a half really had to find ways to be kinder to myself and sort of rethink what I consider to be a productive week. Like Katie was saying. And I also have found just a lot of solace in this idea. I don't know if any of you read the book Wintering by Catherine May, but just this idea that there might be periods in your life where maybe you're not creating, but it doesn't mean things aren't happening. And I decided I was going to embrace that this past winter when my kids were still not in school and we were all just, we didn't want to be doing what we were doing. No one in the house wanted to be doing what we were doing, but we were forced to do it. And I just said to myself, okay, well, what if this is my like fallow period? What if this is the roots are still there, but the tree is not in bloom. And I just did a lot of thinking, and I did not force myself to do a certain number of words a week, which was my typical tactic beforehand. And I have to say, now that spring is here and my children are back in some form of schooling, that all that thinking and just like letting myself just be free with that project, it's transformed the book and not in a bad way. So that was.
Yeah, I love that quote. And I can't pass up the opportunity to talk about Margaret Wise Brown, who is the subject of my most recent novel. But she actually had, in researching for The Upstairs House, which is a book that's about a new mom and Margaret Wise Brown and a lot of other things too. But part of what Margaret Wise Brown would write about is she wrote all these letters talking about how she felt like, in the summer she'd go up to like this cabin and she would like experience nature, but she wouldn't get any work done. And like her conclusion is like there's times of creativity and there's times of receptivity. And it's really helpful to think, like Kate said, in those terms, because then even if you're not like putting words into a document, it doesn't mean that there isn't something inside of you that's sort of working toward your project. And as a parent, I think that's especially useful.
Well, it's also this concept of flexibility, right? That you have to allow yourself to change as your circumstances change. And as you said, Julia, be kind to yourself when maybe you're not producing 50,000 words right away, but you are like, recognize what you're doing is a good thing. I mean, that's so hard, I think, as parents, as human beings sometimes, to also recognize that the quiet times are necessary. Great. You also answered my second question, which is how has your writing practice changed after having children. So Melissa, you started us off by talking about how you write in the morning, right?
Yeah. And, my kids are 8 and 6. So I didn't really start to take my writing seriously until I had my second, and I got a fellowship when he was about a month old. And quite frankly, that's when I actually started really working on my manuscript, when he was about a month old. And I just sort of hit it hard and just kept writing. I was on maternity leave at the time. And then when I went to work, I would edit. I would print out whatever I had written the night before, and I would edit while so when he was very little, that's how I got it done. I wrote at night, printed it, pumping milk, edit as I was doing it. So that's how I did it, right? And then once they both started going to school, I would write on the commute to work. So I had my 45 minutes on the train, 40 minutes on the train. And that's where I would edit on my phone or whatever I printed out, and then work on the weekends. When the pandemic hit, it was like, holy shit, I don't have my commute. What do I do? And there's no coffee shop to go to. I couldn't see my friends and write at their place or whatever. So I was really shook for writing practice. I didn't know what to do because we were all here. I have a tiny apartment in Brooklyn with kids. So it ended up just being that I would write right before they started their lessons. So from 8 to 8:30 or something, I would write. And then I would do some work on the weekends. For me, I really feel the time crunch because I have a very demanding full-time job too. And it's unless I do it in the morning before the emails start coming in, or before the classes start, I get very anxious and I can't get into that space. So I have to just try to do it early.
So watching us right now, we have, I just cut us off, Julia. I'll be quick. So in the audience right now, we have Julie Carrick Dalton, whose new book, Waiting for the Night Song, it just came out this year. And so her comment is that she wrote her first book at soccer practice and in dentist's office and on the train, I'm sure. So the idea of grabbing time is something that so many writers resonates with them. Katie, Julia, what's your writing life look like with children? Are you early morning like Melissa? Are you late at night?
I'm almost exclusively a nap time writer these days. Really, ever since my first daughter was born, and she took a long time. Well, she took several months to get into a good nap time routine, and then she became a real champion napper. So I had these two time slots every day where I could write, and it was at 10 and 3 every day. And so at least I knew that I had those with her, and I got used to sort of working. Before then, like Kate said, in hindsight, the times just seems obscene that I had, sitting down all day. I'm going to take a little while to just kind of get in the flow. I'm going to make another cup of coffee. And now, when this kid could wake up any second, you have to just, you can't, read the last 3 chapters or whatever. You have to dive right in, at least I have to dive right in, starting from the last sentence and, kind of go from there. And what I found when I started doing that was that the writing really took on a new kind of urgency for me, or an urgency I hadn't felt in a long time since I was a kid, really, writing stories because I just had to, or writing, in school because I just wanted to, right? As an adult, I did it for my career, and I edited as my career, but it wasn't until after having my daughter that the writing became an escape in a different way again, a way that reminded me of childhood. It was absolutely necessary for me to get out of kind of all of the mundane aspects of early motherhood. It's the constant diapering and nursing and washing and cleaning and tiredness. And you just can feel very stripped down to these physical aspects of your identity in new motherhood. Your body isn't yours anymore. It's not familiar the way it was. So writing for me took on that different kind of urgency, and that I think really fueled it and changed it and improved it. And it also taught me a different kind of discipline, which was, that I can now sit down for an hour and get stuff done, and maybe it might not always be good, and it might not even be more than a couple hundred words, but it's something. And I didn't used to be able to work that way. So so she still naps, thankfully, at 3. And the baby is a really good napper as well. So doesn't sleep at night, but naps. So when I write, which is not, right now I'm editing my novel. I'm not managing to get to it every day, but when I do, it's always during nap time or when my husband can take the kids, which he has done all day today. So those are really the two times.
So Kate and Julia, I'm curious about your writing process with children, but also the publication process now that you have kids. How did you published your books after your children were born, right? So you don't have a before or an after but how is it different, do you think, having?
I actually, my first book I wrote. You wrote before.
Right. Yeah. Julia, you have.
I had a weird trajectory with both books, kind of. I was pregnant while editing both of them. With my first book, I wrote it, and then I had hoped to be finished editing it by the time my son was born. And there was still like one last round to do. So I gave myself, I think I had like a 2-month period, and then I did like the final edits for What Should Be Wild, which retrospectively, I wouldn't recommend that as a way to do it, just because as you all know, like your brain is just not quite there. And I think that I'll always sort of associate that book with like, oh, what would I have done had I, not been sleeping for like 45-minute periods at a time. But anyway, the second book, so that book, then by the time it came out, my son was almost 1. And then my second book I wrote, like Katie, it took a while to get into a nap writing routine, but my son would not nap independently until he was maybe 10 months old. And so I was just sitting and holding him or walking him in the stroller and just like feeling very resentful and feeling very bottled up. And it's funny because then I ended up writing, when he did finally sleep, I also did like Katie, sort of those nap time sessions where I would just sit down and go. And I totally agree about the urgency when like the clock is ticking and the baby monitor's right there, and any second, you could have you just got to get it out. And I ended up writing about sort of that feeling of being a new mother who was it, I don't know, just like grappling with this idea of like how you can both work and parent and sort of be a mother and like the person you were before at the same time. And so the book, it was like, unlike Katie, where you said, like I'm escaping, like I was thinking about it, I was writing about it, but I think it was all of the stuff I had sort of been bottling up. Now that book has published, which it came out in February, and my daughter is 11 months old and my son is 4, and he no longer naps, and I really don't have any time during the day because they're up at different times. So my writing schedule now has been in the evenings, and it's only fairly recently that I've been able to regularly do this, where the kids will go to bed, my husband will do sort of the last sort of like the end of my son's bedtime routine. My kids are both super early risers, like 5 a.m. early, but it means that they go to bed fairly early. And so what I have been doing, and this is again like the balls that drop, I don't really have all that much quality time, just me and my husband. I don't really have much of a social life in the evenings, which also means I don't have a social life at all. But I've been sitting down, and my goal is to try to do 500 words every day. Which I know like a lot of you are doing 1,000 words of summer, this whole like I can, but for me that is just not possible.
500 is good.
So I'm like 500 feels like a solid goal. Me 5 years ago would have laughed at that. And I'm just slowly getting it out, but sitting down at the same time in the same place at the same sort of like is really, really helpful too, in the same way that naps were helpful. And I think it's been interesting to write 2 books now where like the routine is very set, and I feel like it helps me get in the mindset of a particular project in a way that is making the books very different. I don't know if any of you have had that experience of like, for my first book, like Melissa, like you were working on your commute, and now what you're working on now, like it just takes on something different because your routine is different.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way between my 2 books. It seems like we all are actually in this same situation, that we don't necessarily have like a great before. I didn't write anything until I had kids. And I don't think I felt like I had anything to say until I had kids. And when I did have my first son, I needed somewhere to put those feelings of the sort of drastic change that you go through, your body goes through. And all those feelings went into my first novel, If Then. And I've had several people ask me about this, just the formal differences between If Then and In the Quick, and they're absolutely spring from the way I wrote them. If Then I wrote in like little moments of time, nap times. My kids were reliable nappers, but not long nappers. So definitely like 30 minutes or, and I would just sort of like squeeze it in here and there. And that's a very kind of like multi-point of view, switching to different people's stories. And it has this kind of like, and the whole book is about like a kind of disjointed feeling. And In the Quick, I had this like fantastic year and a half where I had my kids' school times as my writing time. And I wrote that novel in just like a big rush. And it's a book about like someone who's an obsessive and she like gets a hold of an idea and she can't let go of it until she like finds the solution. And that absolutely came out of the way that I wrote it. So it'll be interesting to see like what form, because I'm writing my third novel over such like, I don't know, almost like big changes in my life over many phases. So it'll be interesting to see like what happens formally.
So one of the things that's interesting about this panel today, well, there are many things that are fascinating. One is that everyone is a mother. So there's no fathers here. And there's we do have a producer, Joe, behind the scenes, who's a father. He's on the panel today. But I'm curious about this idea that there are writers who don't want to talk about the fact that they are mothers. They prefer not to be asked about how motherhood relates to their work, many times because men are not asked the same question. How do you feel about this idea, this sort of like separating of motherhood and art, or the idea that women are asked about parenting their children and men are not? What do you think about this, and what are some solutions perhaps so that men can diaper more or have this factor in more in their writing?
I mean, I think the solution is to ask men too. Yeah. I think for a really long time, just because as much as the conversation these days is like, oh, it's all women in publishing, it's a male-dominated field. A lot of the higher level sort of big things that will make you money or make your career have traditionally been dominated by men, still are dominated by men. And so I understand sort of this urge to be like, well, don't treat me differently because I'm a woman. But I also think that makes it harder for people to see that you can do both, and that there are people out there who you think of as these like, big literary names, but like they also have kids and they're also making it work. And I feel like the more that we can talk about the ways it can work and the ways that you don't have to sort of compartmentalize your identity, the better it is for everyone. So I think instead of saying, don't ask me because I'm a woman, I think the solution is for us to have asked a man to be on this panel, probably.
Great. Anyone want to add anything, or want me to ask a related question?
I would just add along the lines of what I was just talking about. I always feel torn about this question because on the one hand, it is really irritating that only women, and it's not just in writing. I mean, women CEOs get asked this question. On the other hand, I really want to know the answer because I'm a person where the two have always been wrapped up with each other. I don't know what I would have to say. It's not like I'm always writing about motherhood, but I am also always writing about motherhood in some way. I'm like processing whatever I'm going through at any given moment. that is so clear to me, even if maybe it isn't clear to my readers. You know, things get mixed up and made weird on the page. But yeah, so I really do. I agree with Julie. I think the answer is to ask the male CEOs and the male novelists and the, you know, that's the end. Because I would love to know, because if the answer is, well, my wife does all of the stuff while I'm writing, that's very interesting. That would be an interesting thing to know.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think as a writer, when I had my daughter, I was very worried about having a child in terms of how it would impact my ability to write, the ability to have the time, to have the headspace. And then when I did have her, and you know, I had these months of not creating anything, I was like, oh God, you know, this fear that I had was a really legitimate fear, and it's coming true, and I'm never going to write, and I'm never going to have a book published, and all of those things. And it really wasn't until that point, you know, that I started hearing more stories from, you know, women writers, you know, writers who are mothers, who are, I think, talking a lot more in the last couple of years about what that looks like for them in a concrete way when it comes to process, when it comes to the headspace, when it comes to how and when they create. You know, whether that including, you know, what their options are for childcare, you know, what times of day they write. Like, I think before I became a mother and before I started really listening out for these stories, I had this image of, you know, a professional or successful writer as being somebody who could sit down from, you know, 9 to 3 or 10 to 5, whatever, you know, to have those chunks of time to really think in this artistic space. And that was very discouraging for me, you know, to think that way when I first became a mother. And hearing these stories gave me a different sense of possibility. And so I think that that's really important to have. That's why it's really important to have these conversations. But I agree with what everyone has been saying, which is that, you know, it shouldn't only be women who get asked this. You know, we should be asking the men. We should know what their support systems look like. You know, we should continue talking about, you know, the domestic and emotional labor that the women in their lives might take on so that they can create. All of those things, I think, should be part of the conversation.
I'll just add on, it's also important to have these conversations so we can talk about money more openly, because it costs money to like have childcare, right? Like it costs money to actually be able to, I mean, there's a reason why I have another job, right? It's not like writing is necessarily compensating me adequately to cover my expenses, right? So like, why don't we talk about that? Because I do have a family. It's not just me sort of living off of, you know, a trust fund or whatever, you know, like, so I think it's important to have these conversations too, because then we can talk about, okay, well, how are we compensating women versus men, right? And how you know, what can we do to support, like, publishing, right? What can publishing do to support women writers or parents who are writers, right? Because there's a whole infrastructure that has to that has to be built in many ways in order for it to happen.
And it won't happen if we don't have conversations like the one we're having now. Exactly.
Right. And we can only include men, right? We're sort of like, we have to ask men those questions so that they can answer truthfully, and then we can start seeing where the discrepancies are and the disparities.
So a related topic is that we talk about books that women write. They're often called women's fiction, whereas books that men write are called fiction. So there's this quote from Jodi Picoult, who said, when a woman writes a book that involves relationships, family, and internal struggles, that's called women's fiction. When a man writes that same book about relationships, family, and internal struggles, it's called the great American novel. So books about motherhood have historically been relegated to domestic fiction or women's fiction. How do you explain this categorization? What needs to change in order for books about parenthood, mothering, the domestic space to be treated as or regarded as more important by the publishing field?
I wish I knew the answer to that. It's interesting because, so my book that just came out in February is about a very newly postpartum mom. It opens with her like in the hospital having just had her baby, and it deals with sort of the horrifying sort of mundanity of new motherhood and sort of the mental space. And it's just very much like it's a new mom book. And it has been really, really interesting looking at the response, like who picks it up, who responds to it. Often who picks it up are mothers, which is wonderful because I hoped that it would be a book that would help women feel seen and feel sort of more part of a community, less alone in having feelings about motherhood that are not sort of like what you see on Instagram from influencers. However, it has been also really interesting watching people's response, because I have heard people say, well, I'm not a parent. I have never been a postpartum woman, so therefore I can't understand this, in a way that I don't think people say, like, oh, I've never been on death row, or I've never, been to outer space, or I've never committed a heist, or whatever it is, where like, well, why is it that motherhood, and I think that it is not just motherhood, I think it's like particularly female experiences, like in order for someone to relate to them, you have to have experienced it, when the whole point of literature, from my understanding, is so that you can sort of get insight into other people and other experiences. And there's just, I don't know, I don't have an answer to it, but it makes me very uncomfortable to hear that reaction, in a way that even having anticipated it and sort of knowing that, like, if you put out a book about like a woman who pees herself after having a baby, you're gonna get people who are like, ew, I don't want to read about this, but I still, I don't know. It's just been really, really interesting to see that response and to see sort of who it doesn't get through to, because it's not everybody. Like, there are certainly some people who don't have kids, people who never birthed children, who respond to it and feel like it's, impactful. But there definitely is an additional barrier there.
I've even had this experience, and my second novel isn't domestic really at all. And it's sort of people saying, well, it's about a woman astronaut, so I'm a man. I'm not going to read that. And I've been really tuned into kind of conversations lately about just sort of, there have been some amazing women action stars and amazing women science fiction stars. And there's still this idea that, a woman can't be at the center of these things that make a lot of money. Oh, but if you have it be a woman, then it's, not, I'm thinking specifically about films, but I think a lot of that kind of filters down into publishing in interesting ways, especially if you're a writer like I am, where you're sort of like, you've got one foot in one genre and one foot in, literary fiction. And so, yeah, that's been interesting for sure, to write a character that's like a STEM focused book and have a woman be at the center of it, and sort of what people have to say about that. So that's coming from like a different angle. Having written a book also about like the postpartum experience, I definitely got a lot of what Julia is talking about, or in a strange way, like I'd be at a reading and the men in the audience would feel like they could only talk about my male characters, but not the new mother or whatever. The only other thing I just want to just excuse me as a former Victorianist. In my other life, I studied novels. I didn't write them, and I always find this conversation to be so, I don't know, funny in a way, because the novel was born of depicting domestic life. I mean, that's the form. So when I hear people talking about the novel as if it's this kind of masculine form, I always just have to have a little giggle to myself, because the thing about the novel is that it came out of a desire to depict the small things of domestic life. And I mean, that's what it does so well. Formally, it's like made to do it. So I really feel like, women writing about women's lives is squarely in what the novel does best. So
I'm curious about it too, and I don't know enough about this, but from like a publishing and marketing standpoint, I'm curious about when the term, women's fiction emerged and why, and what impact that's had on women writers and on, the sales of these books. And I'm curious about how it's affected everything about how they're marketed, from it's particularly the covers of books that maybe don't fit squarely into one genre, that aren't romance or aren't rom-com, but that do kind of straddle the line between different genres. How are those marketed differently, and why are they marketed differently? I don't know the answers to those questions, but it's making me want to do some research because I think that that's a part of this conversation as well. Just a purely kind of like a monetary sales kind of force behind it.
And we did get an audience question that touches on the same topic from Alex. Were there any challenges surrounding the marketing or publicity of your book or books that were gender-based, motherhood-based? If so, how did you navigate those conversations? Melissa, anything like that come into your experience?
No, not so much gender. It was more with immigration and ethnicity and stuff, but not gender.
Okay. Anyone else have a situation when publishing that, Katie, you're still on the path. Mm-hmm. So you're giving us something to look forward to next year. But Julia, any experience that you had that you felt like motherhood became an issue in publishing your book or marketing it?
No, I mean, I feel like the publisher has been supportive. Everyone's been supportive, but it is interesting how much of the conversation is framed. And it's funny because, like, yes, it's just so clearly a book about motherhood, but it's also sort of a book about like being a daughter. And it's a book about Margaret Wise Brown, the children's author, and her relationship with this older woman. And there's like a historical fiction aspect, and it's about being an academic who hasn't finished a dissertation. So it's about a lot of things, but a lot of the conversation and reviews and things like they key in on motherhood, which again, that is also what it's about. So it's not wrong. But it has been interesting to see, like, when I get asked questions, a lot of it is about like, how do we support postpartum mothers, which is great. I think we need to support postpartum mothers more. That's like, a goal of mine in talking about the book. But there are all of these other layers to it that are a lot. I don't know. There's just a lot of questions that I have not been asked, I think, because the mother question is just like so big.
Yeah, on the one hand, you're really interested in the question of motherhood, but on the other hand, there are other things that I'm sure you would love to talk about that are maybe like a little more macro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's hard, and I think, Kate, I'm sure, like you, I actually remember seeing for If Then, like, that it was marketed as like, oh, a new postpartum mother, and then you read it and you're like, well, actually, this is not really this is a book that's about so much more than that. But it's something, I guess, that they can sell. I don't know. It's so interesting.
It's so interesting how different, and I mean, we have a lot of conversations about, I don't have the hardcover, but about whether or not there should be a woman on the paperback. Mm-hmm. on the cover of the book, and sort of there's 3 different women in the book, main characters. I felt strongly with this book that she should be dressed as an astronaut, but the book also ended up pink. Now, I adore this book, so but on the one hand, you're kind of like walking a line between, yes, you want women readers. You do think probably women readers are going to be the ones that connect with it most, but on the other hand, are you shouldering out like a more male sci-fi readership if you make a book pink? It's definitely an open question. I do think it's interesting. This book is being adapted for television, and it's just been interesting to see like how the marketing angles change based on what the industry is. I think there was more of a focus on my mother character in publishing. And maybe that's just because publishing is a lot of editors are women. And I know, like, my editor had recently had a baby when she acquired, that book. I think, it's women who are in that middle part of their life. And so we're all interested in that topic. And it's interesting on the television side, they've absolutely honed in on the woman doctor character, because she's like sort of more active and she's like saving lives. And that's much more, I mean, that totally makes sense for television. But yeah, it's interesting sort of like how you have to kind of like position yourself in relationship to the way your imprint's marketing has positioned you? You know, are you sort of like standing right there, or are you kind of stepping a little to the side? Are you trying to like make a little more room for yourself?
But I think that's the case, like Melissa said, in no matter what sort of your like niche that they choose for you would be.
Yeah. And wait, Kate, so this just reminded me, I don't know, I didn't think of it before, but I had two different covers. So my hardcover had like a very
me too.
Bold lettering,
yes.
Right? Very
Mine
literary. And then the paperback had to be a woman.
This is much more like approachable. Standing by a river. And I love this cover too, I have to say. But it was very interesting. This is for Target. And not specifically for Target, but they really were hoping. There you go. So that's the one for your independent bookshop. And this one was, trying to entice Target.
Melissa, do you want to show us covers?
Yeah, this is V1, right? For award or whatever.
Beautiful.
And this is V2.
Yes.
For like airport flyers.
Yeah, that's right.
So we have a lot of viewers who are writers themselves, and we're getting some questions about sort of the practicalities of this juggling act. And so one of the questions is, how do you connect with other writers during this time of keeping your eye on the glass balls so they don't shatter? I would imagine that connecting with other writers is one of those balls that is like in the closet under the dirty laundry. You don't really get to it all. But how do you find that time to connect, or how do you connect? And then related to that, do you have mentors? Katie, you mentioned this earlier about watching and listening to stories from other writers talking about being parents. Do you have mentors through this process of navigating publishing and writing and parenthood, or just writers you admire that you could recommend that our audience check out, other than all of you?
That, of course, my first response.
That's just obvious. But in addition to this wonderful panel of writers, is there someone else you'd recommend?
Well, so first of all, to your question of connecting with writers, I found Twitter to be, really kind of astoundingly helpful with that. That's how I met all three of these writers. And
I was going to say, I think we mostly know each other from Twitter. So that's definitely right.
Oh, I think Katie just froze.
Katie, we lost me.
Okay, so somebody else jump in. Katie will jump back in when she is unfrozen. Oh, there you go. You're back.
Okay. So, I'm messaging Julia at 4 a.m. last night because the baby's been screaming for 2 hours, and Julia has been, she's read a draft of my manuscript at this point, and I'm so excited to read a draft of hers when she's ready. But I think having my friend May Cobb, we're constantly messaging each other. She just published The Hunting Wives, which is just a fabulous thriller. It's just delicious. So if you haven't read that, you need to read that. But, she is also a mom of a 7 or 8-year-old boy. Sorry, May, if I got his age wrong. But, and I think that there are so many mothers who are writers that I've connected with on Twitter that, of course, now I'm blanking that I'm on the spot. But I think having these conversations on Twitter and kind of making those connections like offline has actually been really comforting during this time, especially of the pandemic, of not being able, to go out and, just vent with your friends the way you normally would, being able to go and, just throw out a quick tweet and, engage for a little while with the comments there, and then take it offline, to the people that you've made those deeper connections with, has been really huge for me in these last few years of writing as a mother, toward feeling like I have a community of some sort. I think that's actually been really important.
Great. Anyone else? Mentors, connections?
Well, I have to shout out my 10 years running critique group, which I was really fortunate to have my friend Lindsay Lee Johnson, who's been in my critique group since before any of us had agents. And, it was like we had like one real bad chapter. I mean, it was really, really, really far back. When I had like just one 1-year-old. My friend Lindsay Lee Johnson, who wrote a beautiful novel called The Most Dangerous Place on Earth, also from my imprint, Random House. That's just totally random. We both ended up there. But she had gone through the whole publishing process of like, you know, get a draft, send out query letters, agent, go through edits. I got to see the whole thing, I think, through to paperback before I signed with my agent. And that was the most valuable thing, to have access to just that, someone else's experience. Obviously, it's not going to be the same as yours, but just hearing that, all that nitty-gritty stuff. And I think, you know, anytime I can, I will send my query letter to anyone, anytime. That's such a strange process, and anytime I can help with that, I'm happy to, because it's so really has not a whole lot to do with once you're actually publishing books. So to go get over that hurdle, it's been lovely to have people help me, and now I'm trying to like pay that forward.
I also think, for me, the year that I debuted, other people who had debut novels coming out that year, if you can find ways to connect with them, obviously that's at a different sort of step in the process. But I became friends with several writers who also have kids, like Etaf Room, who actually, her book, I think, came out like maybe it was the next year, but we had the same editor and we connected. She wrote A Woman Is No Man, and she's got 2 kids, and she was like a young mom doing a million things, and was and is such an inspiration.
Melissa and I are debut buddies.
And then like Crystal Hanakim is another one I can think of, who did not have kids at the time, now has a baby. So I'm really excited. She was already writing about motherhood without a kid. I'm really excited to see what she'll do. But her book, If You Leave Me, she was living in Chicago at the time, and like we went out to get coffee together, and I had like a 5-month-old baby, and I was like, no one's gonna want to hang out with me, like no one cool and literary is gonna want to be with me and my baby. And Crystal was like, yeah, just come, like, you know. Well, she like held him, and we talked about the publishing process. So I think like finding, if you can find people sort of at that level, because everybody, especially when you first start, when your debut is coming out, like you don't know it until you, like, even if you watch someone go through it, no matter how closely you've talked to someone, it's really hard to know what it's like unless you're going through it. And even then, like, to debut in 2020 would have been so different from like when we all did. And like when Katie's going to, the landscape looks different. So just finding people, I think if we're going through it with you, is really, really helpful, and bonus points if they also have kids or are trying to have kids, or, you know, want to take your kids out for coffee.
Melissa?
I was very lucky to, I didn't go to an MFA program, and I didn't sadly study English in college. So I sort of did like a DIY MFA by going through all these different workshops, and I met a lot of writers that way. And one of the writers who I met sort of became like my writing buddy, Lisa Coe. She wrote the book The Leavers. Yeah. And she and I have been writing together now for, I want to say 10 years, maybe. So it was interesting to see her sort of go through that process before I went through the whole publishing process, and to see her book, you know, go. I mean, I saw drafts of it to go from that to what it ended up being was incredible. Etaf is great too. She just so happens we happen to have the same agent, and we connected at a writing workshop, at a writing conference. So, you know, it's also helpful to talk to someone like her, because she has children. For me personally, Angie Cruz has also been wonderful. She's the writer of Dominicana. She's been incredibly supportive. And, you know, as someone who's several books ahead of me, who also has a child, who juggles a job too, it's really inspiring to sort of see her trajectory and have her support. So I think we all sort of need different levels, different forms of support as we go through the process. And I think it's important to sort of pick up support along the way, because you'll need it for different things at different times if you're publishing career.
That's so true.
Mm-hmm. That is great advice. I have been delinquent. I really have been like listening to all of you and kind of watching the clock, but just realized I really haven't been watching the clock very well. So we're coming down the end of our conversation, but I want to just get in a couple last questions if I can. So one is for me, which is, what is the advice that you would offer, one piece of advice that you would offer an aspiring writer who is kind of at this point where they're considering having children and also encouraging their writing to flourish, or maybe already has children and is trying to balance, again, juggle, not balance. So we'd love to have that advice from all of you. And then we also have a question from the audience. Christina has asked, what is your favorite daily thing that you do for yourself, for your daily joy? And I think this speaks to like inspiration and protecting the muse. So two-part question. What's the advice that you would offer, and how do you give yourself a jolt of joy or inspiration? Anybody? Who wants to go first? Julia?
Okay. I think if you're considering kids, I think first off, realizing that it's so much easier to be a writer than have kids than it is to sort of do what Melissa's doing and like be a lawyer and have kids, and a job where it really requires your time is just so your time is yours in an interesting way as a writer. But I also think having a kid, I feel like opens you and makes you feel and think differently than you did before you had a child. And it's almost like, people talk about like, oh, you would like drink or do drugs to open up whatever part of your brain. Like being a parent opens up a part of your brain that you can't access if you don't have kids. And so it's beautiful and it's great and it's hard. But it's not, like a deal breaker. You can't, like, obviously, as we all show. And then for what I do for myself, oh my gosh. Well, Amy Jo Burns, if you're still there, introduced me to this like workout called the Fitness Marshal, which is this like really peppy guy on YouTube doing these dance workouts. And so when I can, I've been trying to do those. And I'm the world's worst dancer, but it's a lot of fun. So not daily joy, but when I can. Also reading.
Yeah, I mean, I think also building on that, advice to a writer who's considering having kids. I mean, I think flexibility, holding the knowledge that your life is going to change, your writing life is going to change, but it will change in ways that are wonderful and that you can't possibly predict right now. And so if the fear is that you won't be able to write if you have kids, I would say, as somebody who has done it twice, don't let that fear stop you. I mean, like Julia said, I've never been more receptive, to use your word, than as a parent, and I think my work has probably never been better than, working in these small chunks of time as a parent. So yeah, I mean, I think some optimism and some hope there. As far as daily joy, I like to take my baby for an hour-long walk every day. He likes it. He's quiet. He smiles and laughs at me the whole time. And then when it gives me time to think, it gives me time to, kind of write in my head sometimes, so that when I sit down, it makes better use of that time. And then also I was really big into Pilates before I had kids. And in addition to the pandemic, obviously I haven't been to the studio in years. So for Christmas, my husband actually got me a Pilates reformer, which was a huge gift. And so that, and so that is absolutely, again, not a daily joy, but, a thrice weekly joy when I can get there. It's very meditative for me and feels good, and is something that's just for me and nobody else. And that's really important.
Wonderful. Melissa, Katie?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So for anyone who's thinking about having children, I can only speak for myself. Children forced me to focus and to cut all the bullshit from my life. Meaning that if I really wanted to take the writing seriously, I had to cut all of the stuff that wasn't allowing me to do that, right? Because like I have to take care of these children, but then where else was I spending my time, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, I know, doing BS that I didn't really need to do, right? And that was taking time away from my writing. Mm-hmm. So for me, children forced me to just be focused and be very, very militant about my time. Mm-hmm. And I'm still like that with my time. Like, won't be late because I only have this amount of time, right? Like, mm-hmm. and like, or just me being diligent with myself and setting time, setting appointments. Like, if I'm going to sit down and write at 8:30, I have to respect the time, honor it, because if I don't, it's not going to write itself, right? Mm-hmm. I've got to show up for it to get done. So for me, kids made me having children made me do that. And then in terms of joy, every day, and this is probably maybe a little, I don't know, whatever, new agey for some folks, but I burn my Palo Santo that I get from Peru, from my mom's hometown. It smells amazing. And I pick a crystal, I meditate for 5 minutes, and I draw a tarot, a card from my tarot. And I will just, I don't even know. I try not to look at the book. I just try to make up a story based on the card that comes up. And that kind of just gets me, oh, okay, so is this what I'm feeling? Maybe it's what my character is feeling. Sometimes I'll just draw a card to see, like, oh, what should happen to my character next, just for fun. And I think that sort of gets me in the mood to go in and be creative and play.
Ooh, I like that. That's great.
Yeah, I love that.
Kate?
I definitely echo that kids make you more efficient. That's absolutely the truth. But I'll speak to sort of the other side of that, in that when you're not writing and you are sort of like tuned in with your children are brilliant. They're brilliant for, a writer to live with, because they are like interest generators, right? They're so, all children are like this. My children in particular can be very intense in this way, and it's a blessing and a curse. But, I wrote a novel about space in part because I had 2 children who were like obsessed with Mars rovers. And that was going to be part of my life, whether I was going to write about it or not. It then is full of all these details about the natural world. And I learned those through my children, and, learned all those things with them. And I think especially in this past year when, I really had to, again, and I wrote an essay about this in LitHub. So if you want to read more about this, but again, sort of like evaluate what I consider to be like working, what's productive, and can thinking or, looking at a piece of art or reading or watching a movie or just being in nature, can that like fall into the category of work if I'm just sort of giving my mind the freedom to think and feel and imagine, which is, for me anyway, during the pandemic, I did not feel a lot of freedom, and I'm sure you all can. I felt like I was chained to my children's iPad. So any moment where I could just be more expansive, I just started calling that work, and it really is. And my kids are so great for that. I just have to start a conversation with them or hear about what they're reading. So yeah, I sort of like just try to lean into whatever it is that they're obsessed with this week. And it's, it's always changing. And that's fueled so many of my books, chapters, just different directions I've taken in my writing.
Great. Oh, I could talk to the 4 of you for hours. Thank you so much for being with us today here on A Mighty Blaze. Before we sign off, I want to give a shout out to the local independent bookstores that you've all highlighted for us today. So as our audience knows, we love indie bookstores here on A Mighty Blaze. And so we asked our panelists to suggest an indie bookstore that we would put in the comments to pre-order, hopefully eventually pre-order Katie's book, but buy the other books. And so I'm going to just run through the bookstores that they recommended. Kate recommended East City Bookshop, which is in Washington, D.C., and actually will be on our show, Authors Love Bookstores, next month. Julia recommended Unabridged Bookstore, which is in Chicago. Katie recommended the Twig Bookshop in San Antonio. And then Melissa recommended Mil Mundos. Did I say that right, Melissa?
Yeah, Mil Mundos. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that is in Brooklyn. So their links are all below. Please check out those bookstores. We've also included links to all of our panelists so you can learn more about them and their other events and other published writing. Thank you all so much. Hold up your please check out the wonderful writing from our panelists. And to all of you, thank you so much for being here today. If you liked today's show, please, and we hope you did, please subscribe to A Mighty Blaze on Facebook, and so you can get notified about all of our events and conversations. You can also hop over to our website, amightyblaze.com, to subscribe to our newsletter. goes out every Sunday, and it gives you a rundown of what's planned for the week. To our panelists, thank you again for being with us. And to our audience, we'll be back here next Wednesday at 4 p.m. for Authors Love Bookstores. Hope to see you then. And until then, be well and keep reading. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.